that are Protestant, there are poor people that are Protestant. And therefore, it doesn't become an explosive topic. That's very different from a situation like that in Northern Ireland, for example, or at least historically. In Northern Ireland, you likewise had a division between Protestants and Catholics, but one in which the class divisions coincided and didn't cross over those, meaning that most of the Protestant population of Northern Ireland was relatively well off, were the upper classes, and most of the Catholics in Northern Ireland were the working classes, were relatively poor. And that obviously creates greater resentments. To the extent to which these kinds of cleavages coincide with one another, they become more and more problematic. Now, if we look at nation states from the point of view of cleavages, of ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions, we'll note that, for the most part, the most divided societies are those in Africa and the Middle East. And we talked a little bit about why that is the case. In each of these cases, in Africa during the 19th century, in the Middle East after the end of the First World War, European powers to a large extent drew the boundaries of the modern state system. And they drew it regardless of the ethnic or tribal makeup of the territories that they were defining as nation states. And that meant that you end up with states like Syria, that consists of a Kurdish minority, of a Shiite minority of various denominations like Alawites, of a Sunni majority, none of which have much in common with each other, and which have deep animosities within or toward each other, historically as well as currently. Iraq is a similar situation, again divided between Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds. In Africa, this problem is perhaps even more pronounced in that countries like Sudan, huge territories with numerous different tribes were thrown together. And generally the pattern in African countries throughout the 19th century was that the colonial powers that governed over these territories tended to try to take advantage of these ethnic divisions in order to help them control these countries, meaning that they would privilege one group over another by granting them higher standards of living, more access to resources, training, and so on and so forth, in order to be able to use that group to suppress the larger majority of that population of that country. And that meant that essentially ethnic divisions were by design made to coincide with class divisions. And that this would bring about various resentments on the part of those that are suppressed, and so on. After these countries gained their independence, goes without saying. And that essentially means that African countries, in many cases, from the day that they were given their independence, were thrown into ethnic conflicts between various tribal groups, ethnic groups, over the spoils of state power and so on. This kind of instability obviously does not lend itself to greater development, and explains to a considerable extent why countries in Africa are still, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, are by far at the lowest end of the development scale in the international system, and the Middle East is not that far behind. Authoritarian governments tend to be problematic, although whether they are cause or effect of the instability and lack of development is again something that is difficult to determine. But insofar as that they are a cause of it, of a lack of development, it is in large part because authoritarian governments generally have far less access, or provide far less access to the public to influence decision making. That's the definition of an authoritarian government, is it's not open to the general public to influence its decisions. It makes decisions in extreme cases on the basis of the say-so of a single leader, without other considerations. The narrower the decision-making process is, the more authoritarian the government is, in other ways of putting it, the more likely the policies of that government are going to cater to a very narrow elite and not to the interests of the general public. And again, authoritarianism in this regard is generally associated with societies in which very small, narrow elites try to govern a large population. And insofar as those local elites don't have an interest in development, they are going to use their influence over these authoritarian governments to prevent any form of development. A final geographic or domestic, well, I guess one could include in both, factor is the existence of resources. And this is, again, a somewhat complicated topic, in that, for the most part, one would assume that plentiful resources should be a big advantage in being able to promote development. Certainly, you can't develop if you don't have any resources. You can't become wealthy without any resources. But actually, if you look at the picture of the international system, one of the main things that distinguishes South Korea, for example, from Zambia, is that Zambia has pretty plentiful resources, like zinc and copper and so on, whereas South Korea has virtually none. And yet South Korea developed fairly extensively, achieved first world status for the most part, and yet Zambia has moved backward. And that has caused many economists to argue that there is such a thing as a resource curse. That in fact having within your territory extremely valuable resources, rather than allowing you to advance in the international system, dooms you to poverty. Not everyone within those societies, but at least the vast majority. And why is that? Well, one aspect of that is that certainly if you have very important resources, very valuable resources, that are in high demand in the international economy, especially in the first world is going to be paying very close attention to your own government. And that attention is going to be focused mostly on can we get access to those resources at a cheap and reasonable price. And they will therefore try to do whatever possible to make sure that that region is governed by a fairly weak government that gives those access to those resources to international developers and so on at as favorable of terms as possible. But beyond that, a resource can be a curse insofar as it makes development within a particular country extremely difficult. And one reason for that is that resources and the productivity of the resource sector to a large extent defines or determines the exchange rate of the currencies used by local states. And if you have an extremely valuable resource like gold or diamonds or coltan or oil or something along those lines, it tends to push up the exchange rate of your currency. And pushing up the exchange rate of your currency is, of course, very good because it means that your citizens that have your local currency can buy things on the international market for very low prices and therefore may be better off. But it's not necessarily good for everyone in that country because if you're trying to make something in that country other than the resource that's being exported, you're going to have a real hard time. Essentially, the value of your currency is so high that buying something outside is always going to be cheaper than buying something inside. In other words, others will have a comparative advantage over your own products. And that means that generally, one of the problems with having strong resource or a solid supply of resources, like oil in Nigeria, or coltan and diamonds in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or copper in Zambia, is that it wipes out all other aspects of the economy. It causes the economy to become overly dependent on a single resource and retards the development of other industries. And it's even more problematic than that, in that resources tend to fluctuate in their value on international markets rather drastically. Just look at what's happened to oil prices over the last 30, 40 years. They were in the neighborhood of less than $10 a barrel up until the 1960s. Then came the OPEC oil shocks, and suddenly the price went way up to around $25 a barrel. And that was seen as a major shock to the international system. We now wish we had $25 a barrel oil. But that was largely artificially created through a process we'll discuss in a few minutes. And at the time, it was assumed that since oil was going to be in short supply, and since the demand for oil kept going up, that prices would still keep going up considerably as well. That oil prices would never come down again. But, of course, that didn't happen. In the 1980s, essentially, oil prices collapsed and went right back, back down to around $10 a barrel. Now, the problem with that is, if you're trying to develop, if you're a country like, for example, Venezuela, that's trying to develop and trying to use oil revenues in order to plan your development, and you have this massive income of oil, and therefore to make investments in infrastructure, and in many cases borrow money in order to get these investments into place. You'll be able to borrow plenty when the oil prices are high, but then when oil prices collapse, you have to pay the interest and the principal back. And suddenly, you barely have the ability to maintain the costs of all your installations, of all your social programs, and so on. In other words, you're thrown into crisis and into default. And this kind of boom and bust cycle, with which Canadians, if they're aware of their own history, are generally familiar, is a very big problem for sustaining a constant form of development and maintaining the stability of that development. Let me move on to a very important consideration in this as well, and that is colonialism. We've talked about colonialism before in this class, and I won't bore you with too many of the details of that. Suffice it to say that, of course, many in the dependency literature and so on, to a large extent, blame colonialism for the poverty of the developing world. Now, is that the case? Is colonialism really responsible for all of this? If so, why? And if not, why not? Well, to make that argument, we first of all have to look at a couple of different forms of colonialism. Colonialism, as I pointed out earlier, and as Emanuel Wallerstein explained, was a search by European powers for regions rich enough to be exploited and weak enough to conquer. That's certainly true. But in that search, Europeans found very different kinds of locations around the world with very different kinds of qualities. And at least on one level, the various regions that they explored fell into two categories. One were regions of the world that were relatively friendly to Europeans, not friendly in the sense that the locals were friendly, but friendly in the sense that the climate was agreeable to the European settlers. And more important than that, that there weren't major diseases that would kill off Europeans in no time at all. For the regions of the world where this is true, essentially Europeans formed what became known as settler colonies. Settler colonies like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, and so on. And these settler colonies have, for the most part, settler colonies weren't good for the local population. The local populations in pretty much every one of these suffered, and suffered greatly, insofar as they survived at all. But those that settled generally did pretty well. And you'll notice that all of those on the list of settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, USA, with the possible exception of South Africa, are now members of the developed world. They are not part of the underdeveloped world. The other category were regions of the world in which Europeans could not readily settle. Either because the climate itself was disagreeable to Europeans, or more importantly, because they were dominated by things like malaria, sleeping sickness, and so on and so forth, that would kill Europeans off pretty quickly. And in that case, they got formed largely non-settler colonies. And the non-settler colonies, the best example, are those that dominate sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And in this regard, if we look at those countries in the world that today are less developing countries, they are almost exclusively in the regions of the world that were non-settler colonies. What happened in non-settler colonies? In essence, they were used by the colonizers as sources of raw materials, with as little involvement and as little investment locally as possible. Some of the most notorious examples of that were the Belgian colonies in what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo, which were handed to King Leopold II after the Berlin Conference in 1884. And he essentially used them in an extraordinarily brutal manner to extract key resources like rubber, by requiring each village to fill its rubber quota and exacting horrible revenge on those villages that did not meet their expected quota of producing rubber and various other sources. Within these, generally there was far less in the way of investment in infrastructure, far less in the way of investment in education, and so on and so forth. The big difference, however, and one reason why this picture of colonialism is still somewhat of a problem in being able to define the relationship between colonialism and lack of development today, is that colonialism is a pretty old process. Latin America was colonized after 1492, but became independent by the beginning of the 19th century. In other words, Latin American states have been states for longer than Germany has been a state. Sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, was not actually colonized until well into the 19th century. That period of colonization only lasted until the end of the Second World War, or until around the 1960s in most of the cases. Most of the French colonies in North Africa gained their independence around the time that Algeria did, in the late 1950s. Most of the British colonies gained their independence in the 1960s. The experience there is rather different from one to the other. The one thing that is key, however, is that on the one hand, colonialism was organized in the interests of the colonizers, not the colonized. Despite what the colonizers claimed at the time, of course the colonizers in the case of Great Britain claimed that it was the white man's burden to bring civilization to the heathens and undeveloped savages of the rest of the world. The French claimed that it was the responsibility of the French to bring the benefits of the French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity to the Third World. But these were all rationalizations of what essentially were material interests that the colonial powers sought to support. In other words, these countries have been to some extent exploited by their colonial masters. But the more important thing is that in each of these cases, the influence of colonialism has been to determine the social structure of those societies. The social structure of those societies. Meaning that the social order that was created by the Spanish in Latin America, the Portuguese in Brazil, to a large extent survived throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century, and there are considerable remnants or residues of that social structure even to this day. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And the same thing is, of course, true of sub-Saharan Africa. Although the social structure was this drastically changed, the instability of sub-Saharan Africa today has a great deal to do with the kinds of policies that I outlined before. Let's talk a little bit about international factors in determining the poverty of the less developed countries. In international terms, the observation has been made by numerous economists that at least part of the explanation for the lack of development and the continuing levels of poverty in the developing world today relate to the terms of trade in the international system. The terms of trade in the international system. And what is meant by that is that in the broadest terms, products fit into categories. In the broadest terms, the categories are primary goods, such as agricultural goods, materials like iron ore, copper, and so on and so forth, versus manufactured goods. Now, the argument with regard to terms of trade is as follows. Essentially, the observation is that consistently, especially throughout the 20th century, the terms of trade in the international system have systematically turned against the exports of the developing world and in favor of the exports of the developed world. Now, why that is again somewhat of a complicated matter, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But one component of it is that with regard to the production of primary products, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of producers competing on international markets. And that level of competition is likely to keep prices relatively low. Whereas when it comes to manufactured goods, there are far fewer producers of those. And thus, the dynamics of prices tend to be to push the prices of or the producers of these manufactured goods have the ability to act in ways to sustain the price level of their products. Meaning that primary goods have declined in their overall value in the international system, and manufactured goods have increased. And since the third world imports manufactured goods and exports primary goods, essentially the countries of the north, of the developed world, have been getting their resources at cheaper and cheaper prices, pushing their standards of living up, while the countries of the south have been getting their manufactured goods at higher and higher prices and selling their products at lower and lower prices, pushing them further and further into poverty and debt. And that's just the nature of the market system. And there's not a heck of a lot that we can do about it, although, as I'll point out in a few minutes, they have tried to do something about that on a few occasions with some mixed records of success. Furthermore, in terms of international factors, many have argued that international institutions are biased in favor of the rich, just as the overall market system is. And indeed, there's a great deal of evidence to support that. Realists, whom we discussed in great detail in the last semester, are probably best at explaining why international institutions tend to favor the rich. They argue, and have argued, and continue to argue, that international organizations, international institutions of any sort, including international organizations like the League of Nations and like the United Nations, are able to be established in the international system only insofar as they are tolerated by the most powerful actors within the international system. The reason for that is fairly obvious. Does the United States need the UN for its own protection? No, not at all. It is more than capable of protecting itself. Who has an interest in the United Nations in terms of protecting their security? For the most part, it's the weak, it's the poor. Now, why would the United States and the other great powers in the international system that don't really have an interest in, or don't need the UN for their own security, have an interest in establishing such an organization? Well, one limited reason, and the reason why they were established, is because they were worried about each other. And the League of Nations is a good outgrowth of that, as is the United Nations. They weren't worried about being attacked by the developing world. They were worried about being attacked by one of the other great powers. And therefore, they were designed in such a way as to essentially allow these great powers to hopefully settle their differences through these international institutions. But the upshot of it is, these great powers will accept the League of Nations or the International Monetary Fund or the United Nations or the World Bank only insofar as they serve to enhance their own interests, and not insofar as that they impose any costs without benefits on them. And that means that an international institution whose aim is to equalize the wealth in the international system would be very welcome by 90% of the world, or at least 90% of the world's population. But they would be completely rejected from day one. They would not get even a hearing in the halls of government of most rich countries. In essence, because it's fairly evident. If you're talking about redistributing wealth from the rich regions to the poor regions, it comes at the expense of the rich regions. And they would never agree to that. States act in their own national interest. And do so without regard to morality or ethics or anything of that sort. That is the key lesson of realism. And as much as individual citizens in northern countries might be favorable toward the United Nations, might even be favorable toward redistributing wealth to the lesser developed countries of the world, their governments will reject it because that's what states do. In that regard, the creation of international institutions in every instance reflected the balance of power, but never changed the balance of power. The League of Nations consisted of the great powers of Western Europe and reflected that balance of power, and no one else was included. And the United Nations, likewise, reflected the balance of power at the end of the Second World War. It included only the victorious parties in the Second World War in the key institution of the Security Council as permanent members. The defeated countries, no matter how important or how wealthy or what have you they may have been, were left out of the picture. Germany has no special treatment, neither does Japan, in the form of permanent membership. And that is certainly also true of the more important economic institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and indeed the UN. The IMF is the best example. 48% of the voting power in the IMF is controlled by the United States and Europe. That leaves the rest of the world with 52% of the vote, and essentially gives the United States as well as Europe veto power over anything that the IMF does. This is something that the Ukraine might want to take into consideration before they sign an agreement with the IMF for their own stabilization. The World Bank, likewise. The purpose of the World Bank was originally known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and was created, in essence, to facilitate the rapid reconstruction of Europe and Japan after the Second World War. And only subsequent to that was more geared toward the development of the Third World. And in regard to the First World, or the reconstruction of Western Europe, it had enormous successes. It reconstructed Germany, which had been more or less bombed back into the Stone Age, within less than a decade, to the point where